and in the state of Arkansas. Today's speaker is Brad Lacy, and many of you know Brad as the director or president and CEO of the Conway Development Corporation and the Conway Area Chamber of Commerce. I won't read his resume because many of you know him, but some things that I didn't know that I found online about him related to his. It's not scary, Brad. It's not scary. Related to the chamber and the CDC and kind of his work there. He's a graduate of the Community Development Institute at UCA, the Economic Development Institute at the University of Oklahoma, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation's Institute for Organization Management, and he's a certified chamber executive through the Association of Chamber of Commerce Executives. So I just think that those things are important to note, to show the extra training that he has done that benefits our city. And so Brad's going to be talking to us today about the city of colleges and kind of education here in Conway. So Brad, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. Well, as with everything else in 2020, this is a new experience in doing a Rotary presentation via Zoom. So I had 3 Zoom meetings yesterday, so hopefully I'm in a good position to deliver this one today. But I will say I'll be happy when we can all be back in person on things like this. I'm not a Zoom fan. Let's just put it that way. I'm ready to be back in person. So, most of you are very familiar with the chamber. But I think that what Santi wanted me to talk about today was really the origins of the chamber and why it was created. And if you look at chambers across America, more often than not, they are created for some reason that the business community, some problem that the business community needed to solve. Our national organization, there is a gentleman there who had spent a great deal of his career researching what chambers do, the history of chambers, and he wrote a book a few years ago called The Magicians of Main Street. And he took these stories from across America about what chambers did. And what I think you have to keep in mind when we get into this idea of a chamber forming over 100 years ago is what the role of city government would have been and how limited city government services would have been. So if you look at us in Conway, we were formed in 1891. So we were just a cotton town that had 1,207 people. So just let that sink in for a minute. We were this little cotton town, rail town, 1,200 people, and there became a need. And again, what we see across America is that there were needs that occurred, and because government wasn't the thing that it is today, it became the business leaders' responsibility to solve these problems. And so what they would do is organize a group to really become responsible to solve those problems. So in Conway's situation in 1891, there was a gentleman named Captain W.W. Martin, and many of you may be shaking your head that you know who Dr. Martin was, but he had this vision that Conway would diversify its economy, which was largely agricultural, by recruiting higher ed into the community. And so, I look back at this and I think Conway was a player in economic development in 1891. You weren't recruiting manufacturing back then in Arkansas, but you could recruit higher ed. And, I will always say that was the most important thing that any group of people have ever done in the history of this town, is to plant a flag on higher ed. So in 1891, Captain Martin decided that we were going to go after Hendrix College as a community, which was in Altus. And in order to do that, he wanted to raise money. And in order to raise money, he wanted to bring together a group of business leaders in an organization that he called the Conway Board of Trade. Again, if you go back into the late 1800s, most chambers were not chambers, they were boards of trade. So that was a common name for them. Really, the history of chambers goes back in the U.S. into the 1700s. So the Charleston Chamber in South Carolina is the oldest continuously operating chamber in America, and I think they date back into the 1700s. So while we're pretty old, we're still not as old as some of those East Coast folks. So Captain Martin forms the Conway Board of Trade, and they raised $50,000. So just think about that for a minute. 1,200 people in a town that was primarily a cotton town that had some merchants, and they managed to sacrificially give their money. There was no public money in that. There was no public money to speak of, probably. And so this is just money out of their pockets in order to recruit Hendrix. So they raised $50,000 and were successful in recruiting Hendrix College. So Captain Martin became the chairman of the board of the Board of Trade, and he held that position for 17 years. So those of you that have been chamber chairman, like Terry, what if you had to be chairman for 17 years? So Captain Martin, he held that position for 17 years. And incidentally, that lines up with when we sort of finished recruiting higher ed, because we weren't finished with Hendrix. And in 1893, we did this again to recruit Central College here, which obviously today is CVC. And then in 1907, with the help of a guy who would later become governor of Arkansas, George Donaghy, we were able to secure the location of Arkansas State Normal School, which obviously today is UCA. In each of those cases, based on what I have read, the business community would put something in the mix. They would raise some money, or they would agree to do something. So by the time we get to Arkansas State Normal School, the local participation was to build a sidewalk from downtown to the campus, which at the time was out in the middle of nowhere. And as my counterpart Jamie Gates likes to say, we're still trying to build that sidewalk from downtown to UCA today. So we're going to get there at some point and get the sidewalk done. So, the early days of the chamber were really focused very much on higher ed. And when we did our 125th anniversary a few years back, we spent quite a bit of time in the archives of the log cabin reading stories about those early days. I think another thing that was real interesting that we found in those early days, not only were they recruiting higher ed, but business leaders were actually getting on horseback and going into the neighboring counties to convince farmers that they needed to bring their cotton to Conway to gin. So, you think about just the most basic type of business at the time was farming. And so they're getting on horseback and riding all over north central Arkansas, convincing people to trade here. And so that's very hands-on in your approach to economic development. Another thing that we learned early on that we didn't know, and again, if you think about, by this time it's 1911, city government probably still really isn't anything major. I'm assuming a mayor would have been more of a figurehead that did something else really in professionally. And so what we found out as we dug in is that the municipal sewer system was a project of the chamber. So in 1911, a group of business leaders decided that they would form an improvement district and tax themselves in order to get municipal sewer up and running in downtown Conway primarily. So, in each of these, what I would tell you to consider, and I hope it's the thing we never lose, is the people here weren't waiting for someone to help them. They didn't look outside of themselves for help. When they wanted to create a sewer system in 1911, they weren't looking to someone in Washington, D.C. or Little Rock to bring that money forward. They figured out how to do it and they got it done. As we continue to trace our history in 1920, we raised $30,000 as an organization for an SOS campaign, which was called Save Our Schools. At the time, the public school system didn't have adequate funding, and it looked as though, based on the articles we read, that maybe it was in danger of closing. And so once again, the business community stepped up and raised $30,000 to bail the public schools out. That same year, they raised $30,000 to put towards a new dormitory at Central College. So they were very active in those early days of raising money for projects in the community. And then really the turning point, I think, was in 1929, sort of the front end of the story of how Conway Corporation was created. And most of you know that story. If you don't, I'll get into it a little bit. But the articles we read, showed this. We had no functioning bank in the city. The banks had all gone under. And the chamber board would meet, and you would see this public outcry. People would talk about how we can't lose these schools. The schools are what make the community, which again is extremely just visionary to think about. You're at the beginning of the worst economic time in the history of our country, and from what I read, it started well before 1929 in Arkansas. I mean, I think it was hard in Arkansas prior to 1929. And so you don't have a functioning bank. There are people that probably didn't have anything, but the community decided that higher ed was worth fighting for, and how do you save these institutions? And Hendricks was really in bad shape. From what we have read, the Methodist Church was trying to determine where to consolidate campuses to, because there was more than one Methodist college. And some of the stories that we read said that there was an idea that they were going to focus on Little Rock to do that. And so the chamber board got together, and the chairman was Joe Fronthal, and they made a decision that they would try. They would see if they pledged $150,000 to the Methodist Church if they would decide to bring that campus here and consolidate at Hendricks. And from what we can tell, they really didn't know how they were going to get $150,000. They just wanted to see if that would work. And so they made a presentation, said, if we give you $150,000, will you consolidate those campuses here at Hendricks? And the church said that they would. And then they went back to work on how do we raise this money, because it is 1929. And there were a couple of attorneys on the board, and they would look into Arkansas law. They had this concept, but they weren't sure it was legal, but they couldn't find that it was illegal. And so the city had an electric generation facility that was actually operating in the black. And so they had this idea that they would form a nonprofit called Conway Corporation, and they would ask the city to deed those assets to this new nonprofit. And because it was operating in the black, they could go out and issue debt, pledging future revenue from the electric department to pay that debt off. And so While in the beginning, it was really about saving Hendricks, that initial offering, that initial offering of money was great enough that not only could they save Hendricks, but they gave money to Central, they gave money to UCA, they gave money to St. Joe, and they gave money to the Conway Public Schools. And so, what an incredible story that we should all be proud of, because, if we're sitting here today, we're in those challenging times again. Would we be willing to do something that bold? Would we be willing to sacrifice for that are the lifeblood of the community? That is a bold move that a group of people did. And I would like to think we would. I would like to think that we would. And so, that brings us to today. And what I would close with today is, 10 years ago, we did a community-wide visioning process that was called Conway 2025. It was transformational, I think, for the community across the board, because anytime you ask the public for their opinion, they're going to give it to you. And they should have that opportunity to help guide where we move in the future. That strategic plan that came out of the Conway 2025 visioning process, many of those things have occurred. Many of those things were complete. I look outside the front door of our building every day at Rogers Plaza, and that was certainly one of the things that came out of 2025. There was this outcry from people that said they wanted to see the blue building go away, and they wanted to see a public park in front of the chamber. And the Rogers family, was a big part of that in donating that to the city. And so, we had this great entrance feature into downtown. We talked about moving the airport. We talked about redeveloping the old airport. We talked about dedicated funding for fire and police vehicles. We talked about dedicated funding for roads. The public talked about how they wanted more roundabouts, not fewer roundabouts. We've certainly done that as a community. And so Conway 2025 helped really shape where we are today. So this is an anniversary year for that process. And how many of you have filled your survey out? Raise your hand. Okay, we got a few. Okay, so for those of you that haven't filled your survey out, we only have a few more days to get those surveys in, and it won't take you long. I put the link in the chat box. So I really encourage you to do that. So as of today, we have about 1,600 responses. The last time we had 1,400 responses, so we're tracking above where we were last time. We also, of those 1,600, have 500 people that have said they want to help write the plan. So that's amazing. And we have a very good, diverse steering committee that, the steering committee makes all the decisions on this. They decide what areas of the plan we'll focus on, because you're not going to focus on everything. There's too many things on that survey that people can select. And obviously some of them aren't as popular as the other ones. And I'll tell you this much. The last time we did this, roads was number one. Roads was number one from day one until the end of the survey period. Roads is about number 5 or 6 this time. And I think part of that is because we've made improvements to roads. And so the things that are moving to the top of the list were not at the top of the list 10 years ago. And I just think it shows kind of the evolution of the community and what people view as important for the next decade. So if you haven't done the survey, please do the survey. Please share it with everyone you know. I think we shut the survey down next week, and we'd really, really, really love to get to 2,000 surveys. So please feel free to share it among your friends, your family, and your places of business. We want a lot of feedback on that, so the steering committee can move forward. I think that's it. These are challenging times. They have been for us too. We went back on August 3rd and are making our way through it. When you make a living doing events, when that's a third of your revenue, and suddenly you can't do events, then you're learning how to pivot and do some stuff online, and we'll start to reintroduce some in-person stuff here really tomorrow. Some of you may be coming to our Bago tournament. We used to have a bowling tournament, and we decided Bago might be a more socially distanced outdoor activity that people can team build on. So anyway, always enjoyed this group. If I had been in person, you could have booed me for being a Kiwanian, even though I don't really go. But I still pay my dues. So anyway, questions?
Brad, I just have a side story real quick.
Okay.
When I was coaching at Conway and teaching civics, I had state and federal government parts of the course, but I didn't have any city local government. And so I decided to write the organization and administration of Conway City Government for my thesis for my master's. And so I put all this together, but my first trip was over to the courthouse to see the charters and read those. And of course, you didn't copy them back then, but they were back. It took them a while to find them, but they found it. And I get it and go over it, and I'm writing, and I asked them to make a copy of it, and they said yes, and all this, and then they're included in these charters was the organization of the Conway Corporation and what it said on why it was organized at the very beginning, the opening paragraph. So I'm putting this together and researching it and everything else, and I get a call from Mayor Walter Dunaway. And he said, come down to my office. And I don't know if anybody have ever been to Walter Dunaway's office, but he had more washing machine coins and Wurlitz or music box coins than any man on earth. But I went down there, and he's counting this money, and he's got all these stacks of coins. And I said, Mayor, I said, what is it? He said, what were you doing over at the courthouse, boy? And I said, I was doing some research for my master's. He said, let me tell you something. He said, I'm going to have to ask you to preview that thesis in front of the Conway Corporation before you submit it. And so every week when I have to submit what I had done that week and get that to them, and then they would approve it and send it to Dr. Snow's secretary for typing, and then they would reread it, and finally I got it passed and accepted. But that was a real experience.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
I've got a question for you.
Okay.
Basically, have you guys done any sort of comparisons, or actually it's probably something for our newspaper, the Log Cabin, but with the 1911, or was it the 1920? When was the pandemic back in was it 20s?
1918, I think.
1918, yeah, and what we got now. I don't know if I've seen any articles on that or even a comparison. It'd be kind of interesting to see, though.
Yep, it would be.
Just one other thing for folks, good old Captain Martin is buried on Hendrix's property there.
One thing I didn't say that I thought was really interesting, when we did that 125-year anniversary for the chamber, we went back and obviously invited all of our past chairs to attend, and then if they were deceased, we would try to find a family member. And for the lunch that we had, we actually had one of Captain Martin's like great nephews or something, and so we actually had representation from his family there that day, which was really, really cool.
Brad,
Yes,
you had mentioned the central landing or the old development of the old airport. Any updates that you can give on what's happening out there? It looks like it's stalled at those apartments, but I've seen other dirt moving stuff going. What can you share?
Yeah, so the apartments are, well, they were affected by a couple things, but the latest was COVID. That developer does all of his interior finish out. He's an engineer, and so everything is extremely organized, and he sources everything from China. So all of the interior, all of the stonework, all of the trim comes directly from China, and so the supply chain got screwed up for him. We're finishing landscaping out there. We have another multifamily development that we're working with for the property. Obviously, retail is not in a great position right now anywhere nationally. So I think we'll probably start reimagining what some of the development looks like out there in the next year or so, because there's just a lot of uncertainty. I mean, even things that were certain a year ago, like entertainment venues, like a movie theater, I mean, that would have been a sure bet 12 months ago, and that's not a sure bet anymore. And so, it's a great piece of property. And the good thing I think about the CDC developing it is we have the ability to hold it for a while, for a long time actually, and make sure that it's developed correctly, and not necessarily to whomever just comes along. I mean, that's always been our view as we develop property, is that it needs to be done in a way that's best case scenario for the community and not just kind of a quick buck.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Right, I've got a quick question about the Business Expo. We understand it's been postponed, but is there any update? Are they going to do that, or can you speak to that?
Yep, we are not going to do that in 2020. That's really the only one that we just can't quite figure out how to do, or even do it online to bring value to the participants. We've looked at best practices from other chambers on how they tried to do online business expos, and there's just nothing that we think is great. And so we're gonna wait until we can do that in person, because we always partner that with a taste of Conway, and right now that's not really great for restaurants either. I mean, it's just strange times. So that one will not come back this year, but everything else will, including our annual meeting, which we were a couple weeks out from annual meeting when the pandemic hit us and the shutdown occurred. And so we are doing a 1 hour televised award show on Channel 11 on October 20th between 8 and 9 o'clock, which will be our 2020 annual meeting. We, the sponsors that are sticking with us, we're encouraging all of them to do home parties, home watch parties, and we're creating swag boxes for them. They're gigantic. It's going to have sort of everything they want or need for the house party in there. And then Channel 11 is going to do some live shots from some of the watch parties, and we think it's a great opportunity for us to really showcase Conway to a larger audience than just ourselves. So we're learning how to get through some of this. Anyone else?
Adair, unmute yourself.
Yeah, Adair, you're muted.
Sorry.
There you are.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Oh, good. Richie and I have had lots of opportunities to literally drive around just because it's something to do. Sure. And it's safe. What we saw, noticing just, going over to the campuses and then downtown and it thrilled me to see the growth in the campuses, and what Conway has become since a kid growing up here. And I can remember a population of 12,000. So that just tells you I'm patting you on the back for the work that you and Mr. Guy did, all those years ago. We did see that downtown, and I don't remember which bank had it, but now there is this staunch, wonderful building, and it was a bank, and no one's in it, across the street from, in the intersection, almost like what I would have said next to where used to be Simon's parking lot is. Do you know if there's plans for another company to come into that big bank building?
I'm not sure I'm on the same building as you.
Okay. Across from, actually, I don't know who is in the corner lot. Go over the railroad tracks, building on the right as you're going west. As you're going.
Are you talking about the old City Hall?
City Hall. That's right.
State Bank and then City Hall?
Yeah. So that is,
thank you.
That is going to be home to the Arnold Innovation Center, which was announced a few years ago in honor of Richie Arnold. It's a Conway Corporation project. So they bought that from the city and will do a major renovation on it. The plans are really cool, and it will become home for really our entrepreneurial community in the city.
Wonderful.
And the conductor will make its home there, Jeff Standridge's group.
Yes.
And so it's a great reuse of that building, and the plans are fantastic. So, Greg, I don't know, you guys were going to start this year, but I think you pushed it off a year maybe.
Yes, the city was a little slow getting out of that building and over to the federal building. Their contractor or whatever, their plans were a little slow. So we were delayed this year, and then COVID hit, and there's been some reduction in revenue there too. So we looked at projects that we could postpone a little bit. We have either started or just about to start some demolition inside the building, and then we'll take that information and try and get our plans a little closer, because there were not great plans on that building. And so we are starting a little bit of work to finalize the plans and understand the cost a little bit better, and then hopefully we'll start that project in earnest in 2021.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to have learned that. That's wonderful. Appreciate it.
Brad, I have a question.
Sure.
The perfect place where we're going to meet next week as a Rotary, I just feel so bad for them, with all the road construction and stuff. How are they doing? And do you help them in any way? Because you cannot have weddings there or anything. How's it working for them in the last year when all this road construction started?
Yeah, I'm not sure specifically for them. I mean, that's always a tough deal for any business that's on a road that's being rebuilt. I mean, we saw it happen along Front Street, 15 years ago when it got completely torn up, and that's just unfortunately a price of progress if you're going to do those kind of major programs, and I think Greg would tell you too. I mean, we have aging infrastructure in parts of the city that's underground that there's no way you can fix it without digging the street up. And so, it's just, it's part of it. Now, I think it'll come back extremely strong when you have a new Markham Street that's redone and new infrastructure. And so I'm excited to see the future for that whole part of town.
I'm just glad that I'm not the owner at this time.
Yeah.
And I have one more question.
Sure.
Last year during the Halloween, Ed Link saved the Halloween for all
right.
in Conway. It took 40 minutes to get there, I think,
yes.
on train, but it was great.
Yes.
He gonna save Halloween this year?
We are not doing the Halloween event this year. You know, we're taking our lead on a lot of our events from the city, and we're not comfortable really doing any large scale event that brings hundreds of people or thousands of people together. So we will do no Halloween event this year.
All right, Ed, I just gonna come with my girls to your house. Be ready. Thank you.
And you know, one thing, you know, Adair, you were kind to give us some credit for what we do on growth, but I'll say this: the secret sauce for Conway is that we all work together, and so you have a great relationship with city government and Conway Corp, and those relationships have always been there. And that's the important sort of trio of power on economic development projects, and we've got an active one right now that we're working on that'll be big if we land it, and it's, I mean, it is a true partnership between Conway Corp and the city and the CDC chamber. So you know, that's really the secret sauce here for continued growth, and if we ever lose that, we probably lose our growth potential. And a lot of communities do lose that. A lot of communities, there's infighting, and you know, it strangles growth in a place. So there's a lot of credit to go around on that.
And you know, Fred, 6 years ago, I went to the Leaders of the World seminar or conference. It was at UCA, and I think John Schaffner took me to my first Rotary meeting in Conway. But you were one of the speakers, and you had all these leaders from different parts of the world sitting there learning about how Conway does well and all the development that we have. And you spoke always so passionately about Conway. I think, you know, now whole world knows what Chamber does here in Conway.
Well, it's a good place.
A lot of that has been over the years. We've been blessed with good leadership.
That's right.
Over 100 years or so, and that's very important. Not a lot of infighting. It's really getting together good leaders. That's very, very important.
You're right.
Don't have that.
Mr. Murphy was really special, wasn't he?
He was. He was.
And you were lucky that you didn't have Mayor Dunaway to contend with. That was one of the funniest things that ever happened.
Sounds like it.
Oh, it was a great experience.
Any other questions or comments before we let Brad go?
All right.
Thanks for joining us today, Brad. We appreciate you giving us the update, and everybody make sure you get on and fill out that survey for him.
Absolutely.
Rotarians, any other questions, comments, announcements?